My, how the mighty have fallen. Excellence used to be an excellent comic. It was obvious that this story about black magicians secretly serving white people under the guidance of all white overseers was a metaphor for the treatment of blacks in America. However, Brandon Thomas and Carrie Randolph couched that in a story about the conflict between a father and son who didn't get along. The tension between Spencer and his father Raymond is where the comic soared. Spencer's need to prove himself, gain his magical powers, and then overcome his desire for his father's approval made him relatable. When his grandmother mysteriously wound up in a kind of magical coma, Spencer can't believe his father would do nothing to help her, so he set out to do it himself. However, he was a magic noob and failed, and as a punishment, he lost the magical powers he'd struggled so long to achieve. In a deal with the Overseer, Raymond gets Spencer's powers back, and this sets Spencer on the path to find out just what's happening between the Overseer and his father. All in all, a good story and good plot. That changed, however, when it was revealed that the Overseer is part of a line of evil white men who are using black magicians to do their bidding for some unspecified reason. After that, the comic fell into the usual woke tropes, pretty much losing the thread on the father-son dynamic while also making the same mistake made in the Black comic series, namely showing that the black characters are so powerful that it strains credulity that they could be controlled on this level. Thomas attempts to explain how this could work in the latest two issues, however he doesn't really succeed. Issue 10 left off with the Overseer threatening Raymond after another failed attempt to capture Spencer. He ordered Raymond to torture those they discovered were helping Spencer. Issue 11 picks up with the crew trying to check on Spencer's apartment but getting rebuffed by a barrier spell. Meanwhile, Spencer heads to Tanner, Alabama to meet Amari Dales, his uncle, to find out what's actually going on. In previous issues, he discovered that Amari was an agitator who fought against the Overseer, and somehow Raymond is wrapped up in this. Spencer uses the teleportation spell to get from Huntsville to Tanner. When he lands, he wrecks the ground but manages to land right in front of Amari, who turns out to be his aunt, not his uncle. Spencer gives a fake name, Aaron Mills, his former rival now ally's name, but Amari sees through it immediately. She actually spends most of the time verbally punking him while Spencer begs for info. Back in New York, Raymond pretends to go along with the Overseer's torture of Spencer's accomplices. He's not exactly on Spencer's side, but he also isn't buddied up with the Overseer. He's trying to subvert the system in his own way, except it's not clear to anyone in the story, or to the reader, what that way is. This was less of a problem when the story was focused on the father-son conflict, but now that it's shifted to this power play, not knowing Raymond's motivations makes it hard to understand why he does what he does. Specifically, it makes it weird that he's so openly condescending and non-compliant towards the Overseer, which in turn makes it hard to believe the Overseer is really a threat because he seems to let this slide or simply doesn't notice it. Instead of coming off as a threat, he's written as an impulsive cartoon villain who makes the Monarch look capable in comparison. The Overseer is more focused on trying to send a message instead of actually dealing with Spencer or this new rebellion. This is a common problem in what I like to call grievance stories. These stories are about some person or group who's been wrong trying to get payback on those who hurt them. For a story to work, the antagonist needs to be evil, cruel, but most importantly, competent. However, the writers usually skip that part because the villain is just a stand-in for a real person or group the writers don't like. The writers don't want to make the villain complex because they don't want to see their real-life opponent as a person. The writer just wants to humiliate the other side, so they make the villain an all-powerful idiot. That may make the writers and possibly readers feel better, but from a story perspective, it makes the villain look weak. It needs to be believable that they could get into power and keep it. The villain's motivations also need to be believable, especially if the story is a metaphor. There needs to be a plausible reason why the villain does what they do. You can't just rely on them being evil for evil's sake, because then the metaphor doesn't work, because that's not how things work in the real world. Very few people do evil things just to be evil. Instead, they usually believe they're doing the right thing. That was certainly the case when it comes to the white enslavement of black people. White people didn't do that because they were trying to be evil. They did it because they genuinely believed, and some still do, that black people are inferior to them. That explains their actions. Unfortunately, that explanation is missing from Excellence. Thomas and Randolph have never explained how or why this situation with the black magicians working under the Overseers happened. We're 12 issues into the story, and essentially know very little about the world that we're now being told is all wrong. Without that explanation, none of this really makes sense. A good example of this is Amari's situation. Women are forbidden from using magic, but Amari visits the Tanner community, openly using her powers, which you would think would bring punishment from the Overseers, but it doesn't. A subplot of the story has always been that women are kept from using magic, and when they do, like Spencer's grandmother, they're punished. For Amari to brazenly use her powers makes little sense, and it makes even less sense considering her actual situation. Amari reveals that she's on lockdown in the town as punishment for the previous rebellion. You'd think this lockdown would shut down her powers as well, but no. She's still free to use magic. However, Tanner has a magic barrier around it that prevents any magicians from entering it unless they're from her family line. That seems like a weird loophole. All it would take for this to backfire against the Overseers is for Spencer or a cousin or anyone from the Dale line to show up, or for Amari to have children. Then they could plot and plan, and nothing would stop them from doing this. It begs the question, why leave the loophole? Apparently, and by total happenstance, the answer is so that it can be used against Raymond as a system of control, because Amari wound up helping the people in the town, and now they can be used against Raymond, along with Spencer, his wife, and his mother, to force him to keep the others in check. It's not that the Overseers planned for Amari to help people, it's just that she did. It's almost like it would have made more sense to strip her away her powers. Amari also says that despite the Overseers controlling the Aegis, the 10th column, the tower in New York, effectively controls the Aegis. And since Raymond controls the 10th, that means he technically controls the Aegis, because when someone incites a rebellion, what you do is give them more power. Why would the Overseers do this? Why would they allow him to amass so much power if the man tried to overthrow them? According to Amari, it's because Raymond sold himself to spare the others' lives, but this resulted in them being under tighter control, like Amari openly wielding magic and Raymond basically running things. Amari thinks her brother believes his sacrifice was worth it, but she finds it to be a fate worse than death, and that would be fine if we actually saw anyone suffering, but we don't. We've got the situation with Spencer's grandmother, one of his friend's moms having some veil over her, but otherwise, it's not really clear how the black magicians are suffering. What we've mostly seen is them being punished for breaking rules, and while we're meant to think those rules are unfair, it's never explained why they're unfair. It's like Thomas is working backwards from the modern day to slavery, showing us what happened in opposite chronological order. It doesn't make slavery less bad when you do that, but it does make it weird to fixate on things being bad in the past when the present isn't as bad. What you would want to do is establish the horrible state first, and then show how this seeming peace isn't as pleasant as people would think, or to have Spencer find out the truth about the system early in the story and then have the fallout. That would allow the revelations to have some weight and meaning. Instead, it's told backwards, so we keep getting told that the magicians have been punished unfairly without any context for why we should think it's unfair. Issue 12 delves into that, but again, it lacks impact. The Overseer tells Raymond that Spencer has been asking for him at Spencer's apartment. When Raymond shows up, it activates a spell that makes the whole building disappear, and Raymond finds himself in a void with an unpleasant memory breaking free of a mental barrier. Whatever it is, he really doesn't want to see it. It turns out that Spencer's spell is causing the problem. Spencer designed the spell to show Raymond the faces of everyone he's betrayed, so it's Raymond's subconscious that causes Spencer to appear as a little boy. He keeps asking Raymond to share the memory, and then the spell would release, but Raymond holds back. Real-world Spencer explains this to Amari as well, over a joint no less, cause what aunt doesn't smoke the Buddha with a nephew? Spencer hopes the spell will get Raymond to finally open up to him because both of them have built walls between them, but he doesn't expect it to work and fears that it might be too late because of everything that's happening. And whose fault is that? You set all this in motion, dude. Back in the spell, Spencer, now taking the form of his mother, demands to know the truth, saying he won't let Raymond see his grandkids, that he would even end the family line out of spite. Raymond at first resists, but then begins to break, and we see what he's been holding back. Massive rows of gallows. I think we could take a wild guess at what happened. Whatever rebellion Raymond led failed, and the Overseers forced him to watch the execution of his allies. Amari tells Spencer that everything he knows about the Aegis is a lie. The Overseers created the Aegis and columns as a means of control, and deliberately made them unequal, giving more privileges to some than others, like the New York Tower, leading to envy and finally conflict among the magicians. The metaphor is obvious, the conflict between the field and house slaves. However, since we never see this play out in the story, it flops. Where is this divide? Where is this conflict? How is it that none of them realize the game being played by the Overseers? These are valid questions because in the real world, slaves were perfectly aware of whites using privileges as a means of control. Why wouldn't this occur to these very powerful, very intelligent magicians? Amari then shows Spencer a vision of the war. During the war, there had been 7 columns. When it ended, only 5 remained. She tries to go on, but Spencer stops her because he notices she's in the vision fighting using magic, something she's not allowed to do. She asks him what the 4th wall says exactly, and he says, the use of magic by females is not allowed. She asks how long it said that, and he says forever, and she's like, nah. They changed it. After the war, it said the use of magic by females is no longer allowed. And according to Amari, the fourth wall has been rewritten dozens of times. This is meant to be a huge revelation, but again, it flops because it's not clear why the overseers would keep changing the rules for women, assuming that's what the fourth wall primarily addresses. Obviously, it's a metaphor about the treatment of women in society, but without any story context for why women are being held back, it doesn't work. And this has been a subplot since the first issue, so we're well past the point of dancing around this. The readers ought to know why the overseers consider women a threat. Instead, we're told that the overseers keep changing the rules as a means of control. Even the war was just another system of control. The overseers found the greatest sorceress of her age, who everyone called the Absolute, and trained her and other powerful girls to do their dirty work. Once the overseers no longer needed the girls, they tried to take away those privileges and power, but the girls fought back, with Raymond leading the way, but their rebellion failed. The overseers executed them, forcing Raymond to watch until he finally broke when it appears they tried to kill the one person he couldn't bear to see die, his wife, the Absolute, who apparently is still a badass and able to shatter whatever barrier the overseers have set up in her home. And that's where it ends. I guess that's fine. It doesn't make much sense, but at least it's moved away from the overt white people be evil angle. However, it's now settled into the no man's land of zero gravitas because none of this carries any weight because we aren't connected to the characters these terrible things happen to. The closest connection we have is with Raymond, but he's been an antagonist for most of the story, and just showing him suffer doesn't explain all this. What's missing is the emotional connection to the massacre. What we needed was for Spencer to find out about that, to find out about how far the overseers had gone, to find out that his father was part of it while not having the full story. Then you could reveal the truth, like what Kishimoto did with Sasuke finding out the truth behind why Itachi murdered their entire clan. It works because we get Sasuke's perspective as he draws the wrong conclusion based on what he's experienced. But if we were never told about him witnessing his brother murder their parents, or Itachi using illusions to force Sasuke to relive the decimation of the Uchiha clan, if we were just told that he wants to kill his brother, and then we get the true story after Itachi dies, now it just makes Sasuke look stupid, and the moment lacks weight. There's so much Spencer doesn't know, and since we're following his story, so much the audience doesn't know, that none of this hits the way it should. This could be a moment for Spencer to realize he's misjudged his father, but that doesn't happen. Sure, he learns that there are greater powers at play than he ever realized, but when was he given the chance to? The 12th issue also leaves so many questions, like what's happening with the other columns? Where are the other columns? Why didn't they unite after the war after seeing what the overseers did, or were they kept in the dark? Why would the overseers allow the Absolute to have a kid with the guy who rebelled against them? Why wouldn't the overseers shut off women's powers like they did to Spencer? I could keep going, but I think the point is clear. It seems like Thomas and Randolph are writing the story like everyone knows what they know. That's the simplest explanation because the team is too good to have lost their skill. There are so many revelations, but too much backstory not being told to the audience for the moments to hit the way they should. It's also making the situation look ridiculous because if the overseers are this powerful and cruel, it makes no sense that they would leave so many powerful magicians alive. And if the magicians are so powerful, it makes no sense why they wouldn't band together again, now knowing how the overseers would react. There's simply too much backstory missing for any of this to make sense, and it's not clear if we're ever going to get it. After all, it took 12 issues for us to finally find out what's going on with Raymond and the overseer, and we only got part of that story. It's just dragging along, and it's hard to stay interested when what does get shown to you you can see coming from light years away, and when they're releasing 2 books a year. But maybe the story will recover. Maybe Thomas and Randolph will drop the Waz Kangz trope and go back to telling an interesting metaphorical story about racism, because that was working. This, not so much. But what do I know? I'm just some guy.